Hey guys, tonight we begin with a topic the ancient Egyptians took both seriously and strangely casually: sex, but not in the way modern minds might assume. Forget Hollywood seductions or over the top rituals under the pyramids. Imagine instead a quiet courtyard, the scent of lotus flowers, the warm hum of insects, and a young couple passing each other with side eyes and nervous laughter, maybe sharing a basket of figs. In ancient Egypt, sex wasn't a taboo or a political minefield. It was simply part of life, as necessary and natural as the annual flooding of the Nile. So let's get cozy, dim. The lights maybe turn on that soft fan hum in the background and settle into a civilization that viewed sexuality not as sin or scandal, but as divine, earthy, and refreshingly balanced. To the ancient Egyptian, sex was less of a moral dilemma and more of a bodily function wrapped in symbolism. Like eating, sleeping, or paying your taxes in grain, it was part of the cosmic rhythm of things. The idea that sex should be hidden, whispered about, or wrapped in layers of social guilt, that simply wasn't how they saw it. In fact, they might have looked at later society's prudishness and thought, why are you all so weird about this? Egyptians didn't separate the body from the soul the way many later religious traditions would. Their concept of Mahat, a kind of cosmic harmony or balance, meant that everything in life, including pleasure, had its place. When things were in balance, the crops grew, the rivers flowed, people stayed healthy, and yes, romantic and physical relationships thrived. When they didn't, time to call a priest, light some incense, and maybe reevaluate your choices in lettuce offerings. Yes, lettuce. We'll get to that soon. But back to the basics, sex was considered sacred, not in the don't touch it way, but in the sense that it was tied to creation renewal and the eternal cycles of nature. The gods themselves were sexual beings, often in very creative ways. The myths are filled with stories of births that came from magical unions, divine couplings, and in one case, a god who quite literally jump-started the universe all by himself. What's striking, though, is how open Egyptians were about their views. While many ancient societies shrouded sexuality in coded language or avoided the topic altogether, Egyptians went the other way. Their art, poetry, and everyday writings reference love and desire with a kind of relaxed frankness. You'll find inscriptions that talk about longing, attraction, dreams of beauty, and even the occasional, not so subtle metaphor involving fig's fish and brewing beer. They weren't scandalized by the act. They were more concerned with context. Was it consensual? Was it respectful? Were you involving someone else's spouse or causing drama that might upset the social apple cart? If not, then carry on. The gods are watching, but they're probably fine with it. This attitude filtered into Egyptian architecture as well. Homes often had designated private spaces, quiet little corners, tucked away from the bustle of the central courtyard. Ancient builders blessed them, even understood the subtle art of placing bedrooms away from granaries and noisy goat pens. Love apparently doesn't flourish next to livestock. Temples were filled with fertility symbols. Figurines of Hathor, the goddess of love and music, often appeared in semi-nude form, smiling serenely, as if she knew exactly what you were thinking. Shrines to men. The god of virility didn't even bother with subtlety. He stood tall and proud, shall we say, lettuce in one hand, unmistakable enthusiasm in the other. But even beyond the sacred everyday, Egyptians understood intimacy as part of life. Romantic affection was depicted in tombs and household art, not just as symbolic stiff representations, but with genuine warmth. Couples held hands, embraced, or were shown in close, affectionate poses. It wasn't shocking, it was human. And this wasn't limited to the elite. Farmers, potters, scribes, ordinary people all experienced love, desire, and partnership. Relationships were often built on shared labor, laughter, and yes, attraction. And while their bedrooms didn't have locks or mood lighting, there was space, both literal and cultural, for connection. What they didn't have: purity rings, guilt-based education, or long lectures about how holding hands might summon a crocodile demon of moral decay. Their focus wasn't on abstinence, it was on harmony, and maybe also on not getting caught in an awkward love triangle, which still managed to happen because, well, humans are humans. So tonight, as we float down the Nile of ancient thought, remember this: for the Egyptians, sex wasn't scandal, it was sunlight, natural, life-giving, and worth weaving into your art, your prayers, and your daily bread. And yes, sometimes it was also worth writing on a broken piece of pottery and leaving on your lover's doorstep. Because who needs a texting plan when you've got terracotta? Flirting in ancient Egypt didn't involve swiping right or decoding vague emoji messages. It involved perfume, eye makeup, carefully selected words, and maybe a lotus flower or two casually tucked behind the ear. If that doesn't sound like a lost art, it's because it probably was. In the land of the Nile, flirting was part fashion statement, part performance, and part magical invocation. There wasn't a rigid courtship protocol like in Victorian England or Renaissance ballrooms, no courting with intent or 6-month engagement trials. Instead, attraction often started with a glance across a courtyard, a comment exchanged while trading goods, or a cheeky compliment during a festival. It was light, playful, and often scented with incense or ground cinnamon. And let's talk about eyeliner. Egyptian men and women famously wore kohl, a black cosmetic applied around the eyes, not only to reduce sun glare and ward off infection, but let's be honest, to look incredible. Imagine trying to resist someone with dramatic cat eyeliner and a smile that smells like myrrh. You wouldn't stand a chance. Their beauty routine wasn't about modest enhancement. It was bold, expressive, and fully intentional. Kohl lined the eyes, henna stained the fingers and toes, and oils made skin glow in the desert sun. Aesthetics weren't vain, they were social tools. And oh, the perfume. Egyptians didn't just dab on a bit of scent before heading out, they practically bathed in it. Perfumed cones of wax were placed atop the head during banquets and slowly melted over time, releasing their fragrance as the evening progressed. Imagine your crush sitting across the room, their perfume cone gently liquefying as the night warms up. That's the kind of subtle seduction that doesn't show up in modern dating guides. Clothing helped too. Linen garments were the standard, light, breathable, and ideal for a climate where heavy robes meant instant regret. But they weren't just practical. Sometimes they were sheer and pleated and deliberately suggestive. A bit of shoulder, a glimpse of leg, or a carefully tied sash could say just enough without saying too much. Modesty wasn't rigid, it was optional. Flirtation also lived in poetry, and not the abstract kind. These weren't flowery declarations, about eternal longing and impossible virtue. Egyptian love poems were cheeky emotional and filled with metaphors that involved fish beer and gardens. One girl might write about pretending to be sick so her lover would come visit her, then miraculously feeling better the moment he arrived. Another poem might compare a man's voice to more intoxicating than wine, which is either a high compliment or a gentle warning. They didn't tiptoe around desire. They leaned into it, danced with it, and sometimes sang about it during festivals, especially during the festivals of Hathor, the goddess of love music and intoxication. These celebrations were part religious rite, part community gathering, and part ancient speed dating with tambourines. People laughed, drank, danced, and if the moment felt right, paired off under the stars. Think of it as Burning Man meets sacred cow imagery, and yes, they use spells, actual love spells. If someone caught your eye and you weren't sure how to seal the deal, you could consult a local priestess or healer for a magical incantation. Maybe it involved a bit of hair, a written charm, or the symbolic burning of an offering. Egyptians didn't always leave romance up to chance. They occasionally gave it a little nudge with supernatural assistance. It wasn't all theatrical seduction, of course. A lot of it was just sweet. Two people tending neighboring fields, sharing bread, exchanging teasing remarks during a water run. There was space for innocence as much as there was space for spice. Because while the gods might be involved, most Egyptians didn't live inside epic myths. They lived in villages in dusty houses with palm leaf roofs where attraction grew in the quiet moments between chores. And while modern dating apps have their appeal, there's something charming about the idea that flirting once meant hand-picked flowers, scented oils, and verses carved on pottery. Fewer typos, more poetry. Even the hieroglyphs tell part of the story. They didn't have a dedicated emoji for let's grab dinner, but there are plenty of symbols that hint at affection, clasped hands, lotus flowers, birds feeding each other. Symbols that to those who could read them whispered little messages of love and interest. So while we might think of ancient Egypt as stiff and statue-bound, the truth is, it was a world full of glances, gestures, and quiet longing. A civilization where a woman's wink could be just as powerful as a spell, and where love could blossom between rows of barley or beside a shrine to a fertility god holding lettuce. Yes, that lettuce is coming up again. And no, you're not imagining the symbolism. In the end, flirting in ancient Egypt was a performance of presence. It was being seen literally and figuratively. A deliberate walk past the same vendor's stall every morning. A smile held a second too long. A lotus flower left on the doorstep. Romance didn't need fanfare, just timing scent, and maybe a well-placed line about dreams and beauty by night. If you want to understand how ancient Egyptians viewed sex, you can't skip the gods. These weren't remote aloof deities who lived in celestial silence. No, their pantheon was filled with beings who loved, lusted, created, argued, and occasionally got a little experimental. If human sexuality was sacred, it's because the gods made it so, sometimes in mythological ways that would make even a modern astrologer blink twice. Let's begin with Atum, the OG creator god. According to one widely accepted creation myth, Atum brought the universe into existence through enthusiastic solo effort. No cosmic partner, no divine assistance, just one determined deity and an act of self-generation that was considered deeply holy, not awkward. From that act came the first gods Shuer and Tefnut moisture. So yes, the Egyptian universe began with a one-god show and an artistic interpretation of bodily fluids. And yet no one was scandalized. This wasn't treated as crass. It was revered. Life started with desire, with self-driven creation, and it was something to respect, not hide. Then there's the legendary couple Osiris and Isis, the golden standard of divine romance. Osiris was murdered and chopped into pieces by his jealous brother Set. Isis, fiercely loyal and resourceful, reassembled his body with care, devotion, and some impressive magical skill. One crucial part, however, was missing. So what did Isis do? She made a new one. Magically. You can guess which part. She then used it to conceive their son, Horus. That's love. And possibly the first recorded instance of divine prosthetics being used in a fertility context. But the pantheon doesn't stop there. Let's talk about Min. You could call him the god of fertility, but that doesn't quite capture his presentation. He was usually shown standing straight up, every part of him, including his unmistakably erect symbol of male potency. In his hand, a stalk of lettuce. Yes, lettuce. We'll circle back to that little leafy detail later. But Min was not a subtle god. Shrines in his honor featured ritual offerings of, you guessed it, lettuce, and his worship involved public celebrations that were, let's say, enthusiastic. Ancient statues of Min leave very little to the imagination. You didn't need a priest to interpret the symbolism. Then there's Hathor, the goddess of love music, dancing joy, and just a pinch of divine intoxication. She was often depicted as a beautiful woman with a cow's ears or horns, which sounds strange until you realize she represented maternal tenderness and sensual joy all at once. Festivals in her honor were filled with music, laughter, feasting, and flirtation. Think of it as sacred partying with tambourines. She wasn't a goddess who frowned on pleasure. She encouraged it, celebrated it, and made sure you knew it was okay to enjoy yourself. Even Ra, the all-powerful sun god, had his own unusual connection to reproduction. Depending on the myth, he could create through speech, through spit, or through less verbal means. Some myths even describe Ra aging, losing his power, and needing rejuvenation from female deities. The implication power could be renewed through intimate sacred connection. The gods didn't shy away from their bodies. They didn't hide their desires. They embodied them, sometimes literally. Creation and intimacy were interwoven, not kept apart in different moral categories. They didn't need purity codes or confessions. They needed balance. When divine unions happened, whether joyful, tragic, or downright peculiar, they often resulted in more gods, more life, or more stories. And that's what mattered. One curious feature of Egyptian mythology is how gender could flex. Certain deities were gender fluid or took on aspects of both sexes. The god Hapi, for example, represented the life-giving Nile and was depicted with both masculine and feminine traits, symbolizing abundance, fertility, and the merging of opposites. Other deities could change form or combine with others, blurring the lines between male and female, active and passive. The cosmos wasn't concerned with strict binaries. It was concerned with harmony, and all of this had real-world effects. If the gods treated sexuality as divine humans did too, they mirrored the gods in their art prayers and relationships. They weren't just copying myths, they were participating in a worldview where the sacred and the sensual overlapped. A carved fertility figurine wasn't obscene, it was devotional. A nude goddess wasn't shocking, she was powerful. And a temple image showing men standing proud wasn't something to be censored. It was a reminder that life begins with vitality and joy. So when you think about Egyptian religion, don't picture dusty tombs and stern priests. Picture incense-scented halls, priests offering lettuce under starlight, and murals that celebrated the full, messy, beautiful cycle of life. In the world of the gods, sex wasn't a sin to avoid, it was a spark to honor. Sometimes with poetry, sometimes with dancing, and yes, sometimes with truly heroic lettuce symbolism. Marriage in ancient Egypt was delightfully uncomplicated. No priests, no vows, no legal registries, no bridal expos or monogrammed hand towels. Just two people, a shared house, a loaf of bread, and the mutual agreement that yes, we live together now, and ideally, don't drive each other crazy. It was the kind of low-drama, high-practicality system that might make modern wedding planners weep gently into their champagne towers. There were no formal ceremonies, at least not in the way we think of them. You didn't need a public ritual to be considered married. If two people moved in together, shared food and resources, and publicly acknowledged each other as spouses, that was it. Boom, married. The community nodded, maybe offered a few practical gifts, linen beer, perhaps a goat, and life moved on. No bouquet toss, no uncle doing the crocodile dance at the after party. That's not to say marriage wasn't meaningful. It absolutely was. But it wasn't wrapped in layers of red tape or divine pressure. Egyptian marriage was less about public performance and more about forming a stable household, a partnership built on shared labor, mutual care, and hopefully a little affection along the way. Of course, love wasn't always the primary motivator. Especially among the elite, marriages could be political arrangements designed to merge property, maintain social ties, or in royal cases, preserve the all-important divine bloodline. But for the average farmer or scribe, the logic was simple. Survival was easier in pairs. Someone to bake the bread, thresh the grain, manage the goats, and remind you when you left your sandals outside overnight. Again, still affection played a role. Many couples expressed tenderness, companionship, and even romantic admiration. Tumart often depicts husbands and wives standing face to face, holding hands, or resting arms around one another in gentle poses. Not stiff formalities, genuine gestures of connection. It wasn't just a contract, it was a shared life. And when people chose each other, they really did choose. There's no evidence of forced marriages being the norm. Women, even in the lower classes, often had a say in who they married. Consent mattered. And divorce. That was on the table too. In fact, divorce in ancient Egypt was almost as simple as marriage. No lengthy court battles, no dueling lawyers with scrolls of accusations. If a couple decided things weren't working out, maybe there was too much snoring, not enough bread, or a suspicious fondness for the neighbor's pottery, they could separate. The property was divided and they went their separate ways. Some agreements were written up to make the process clear, especially in later periods. And women could initiate divorce. That's not a typo. In a society 3,000 years old, a woman could decide the relationship was over and leave. No scarlet letters, No public trials. Sometimes couples even signed marriage contracts, ahead of time, ancient prenups, if you will. These documents spelled out what each person brought into the marriage, what they'd keep if they split, and what penalties might apply if someone misbehaved. For example, if you strike me, you owe me 5 silver daben. Not terribly romantic, but incredibly practical. And in a society where stability mattered more than ceremony, it made perfect sense. Marriage contracts also reinforced women's rights, something ancient Egypt was surprisingly progressive about. Women could own property, run businesses, sue in court, and if necessary, take an ex-husband to task for failing to live up to his end of the deal. Egyptian society may have been patriarchal in broad strokes, but individual women wielded more legal autonomy than many of their counterparts in later civilizations. There were expectations, of course: fidelity, cooperation, shared responsibility. And yes, there were societal double standards, more on that later. But the essential shape of marriage was cooperative. Two people managing life together under the eye of the gods, ideally, with fewer goats in the kitchen than usual. Children were often part of the package, though not immediately. The pressure to conceive existed, especially in upper classes, but couples also had access to early contraceptive methods and herbal remedies. They didn't assume that every marriage had to result in 12 children and a broken roof. Sometimes it was just the two of them sharing meals, working the fields, and trying not to get into arguments during the flood season. There wasn't much pageantry around getting married. No wedding dresses, just the usual white linen, clean and pressed. No fancy rings. No toasts from slightly tipsy friends. Just a life beginning, quietly built on mutual benefit, shared hopes, and perhaps a little flirtation that began years earlier at a festival over a shared drink with a wink and the subtle suggestion that they'd better leave the party before the neighbors started talking. Marriage wasn't sacred in the moralistic sense. It was sacred in the everyday sense. Sacred in the way tending a garden is sacred, or baking bread, or repairing the roof before the next big wind rolls in from the desert. Sacred because it was part of life's rhythm. Steady, practical, occasionally romantic, sometimes frustrating, but always anchored in the real. And when it ended, if it ended with dignity. No one was burned at the stake. No one lost everything. There were rules, of course, but also compassion, because even in a society ruled by gods and myth, people still needed space to figure things out. So the next time someone tells you ancient marriage was all rigid rules and chaste expectations, just smile and picture two Egyptians sitting on a rooftop at sunset, sharing bread, swatting away mosquitoes, and agreeing that this quiet, practical, mutual thing is probably good enough. Now, as much as ancient Egyptian marriage could be grounded in love and practicality, human nature still had its say. People talked, neighbors gossiped, and occasionally someone got caught sneaking out of someone else's house with a tunic slightly askew and an awkward excuse about borrowing lentils. Because let's be honest, affairs, jealousy, and romantic chaos weren't invented in the modern age. They just happened to be painted on papyrus instead of posted on social media. Despite the general openness towards sex, there were still boundaries, mostly around property inheritance and marriage contracts. Crossing those lines especially when it involves someone else's spouse, could trigger more than just side eyes at the market. But interestingly, it wasn't always about harsh punishment. More often, the consequences came in the form of reputational damage, poetic insults, or yes, pottery. Let's say your neighbor catches wind of a scandalous affair between the baker and the brewer's wife. It's not going to make the front page of the Theban Times, but it might make it onto a potsherd, a broken piece of pottery with a hastily scratched note that says, "May his beer go flat and his roof cave in." Ancient Egyptians loved writing quick jabs or anonymous commentary on whatever fragments were available. It was the Facebook wall post of its day, except with worse spelling and more dust. Jealousy also had magical consequences. If someone felt betrayed, they didn't just stew in silence. They might visit a local healer or magician for a spell. Maybe a little wax figurine to bind the lover's heart, or a written charm to return what was stolen. Some spells were designed to drive rivals away or rekindle affection. Others were more petty curses to make the unfaithful partner's bread always burn, or their sandals fall apart mid-walk. You know the everyday heartbreaks. Affairs happened. They weren't always punished severely unless they caused a serious disruption, particularly among the upper classes. A nobleman might get away with a fling or two, but a noblewoman caught in adultery risked her reputation, her wealth, and sometimes her freedom. It was unsurprisingly a double standard. The system wasn't fair. It was structured around inheritance lines and male ego with a sprinkling of divine anxiety about cosmic balance. That said, not all affairs ended in drama. Some were simply ignored. Others became the stuff of quiet legends. And sometimes, a love triangle turned into a sort of uneasy triangle of tolerance, so long as no one upset the household income or made a scene at the temple. Even the gods weren't immune to romantic messiness. Remember Set, who killed Osiris out of jealousy, or the occasional squabbles between Hathor and other deities. When mortal lovers got a bit too devoted, divine soap operas were not uncommon, and humans seemed to take that as a sign that their own relationship hiccups were, if not blessed, at least relatable. In literature, too, Egyptian writers didn't shy away from the emotional turbulence of love and betrayal. Stories from the New Kingdom describe foolish lovers, scheming rivals, and bittersweet endings. One tale features a man who falls in love with a married woman and meets a predictably grim fate, complete with curses, shame, and the quiet disapproval of a jackal-headed god. But even in those cautionary tales, the tone was rarely one of moral condemnation. It was more like, well, what did you expect? Adultery wasn't the end of the world. It was just the kind of mistake that made your aunt whisper about you at dinner for the next 5 years. Among commoners, things were even more relaxed. If two unmarried people had a fling, it wasn't a crisis. If it didn't interfere with their work or someone else's grain storage, it was mostly private business. But if it involved broken promises, unpaid debts, or the sacred goat being gifted to the wrong household, well, then things got complicated. Because love was one thing, logistics were another. Women had more recourse than you might expect. If a husband strayed too far or failed to fulfill his role, a wife could confront him, file for divorce, or seek restitution. It might not repair the relationship, but it restored the balance, a very Egyptian priority. And sometimes these relationships weren't so easily categorized. A woman might have children with a man she never officially married. A scribe might support two households, one legal one quietly unofficial. Families adapted. Communities winked and nodded. As long as no gods were angered and no bread ovens were destroyed in the process, life went on. It's easy to assume ancient people were stricter or more reserved, but that's mostly modern projection. In truth, the Egyptians understood emotional complexity. They accepted desire, acknowledged mistakes, and made room for disappointment. They didn't expect everyone to behave perfectly. They expected them to manage the fallout with grace and maybe a backup plan involving honey and apologies. So, yes, affairs happened. Jealousy flared, hearts broke, and sometimes someone ended up writing love poetry on the back of a receipt. But somehow it all fit within a system that valued balance over judgment, restoration over punishment, and when all else failed, a good curse to make the cheating ex's sandals mysteriously vanish before the market day. Now, if you thought things couldn't get more eyebrow-raising, buckle your linen belts. Because in ancient Egypt, keeping it in the family wasn't just tolerated among royals, it was expected. And by family, we're not talking third cousins twice removed. We're talking brothers and sisters, sometimes full siblings, sometimes half, sometimes so tangled in the dynastic family tree that even the gods would have needed a flowchart and a glass of date wine to keep up. To understand why this happened and why nobody seemed to flinch, you have to understand how ancient Egyptians viewed royalty. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were living gods, not metaphorically, literally. As far as the state religion was concerned, the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, the son of Isis, and Osiris, destined to uphold Ma'at, the balance and order of the universe. And what did the gods do to maintain cosmic harmony? They married each other, siblings usually. Isis and Osiris, Shu and Tefnut, Geb and Nut. In myth, divine order was preserved through these incestuous unions. So if the gods did it, then naturally the royal family descendants of the gods should follow suit. Cue the sibling weddings. This wasn't about romance. Nobody was whispering sweet nothings over crepe platters in these arrangements. This was strategy, politics, control. Marrying a sibling meant keeping the royal bloodline pure, the power consolidated, and rival families firmly out of the succession picture. It was dynastic gatekeeping at its most intense. Take Tutankhamun. Yes, that Tutankhamun. DNA analysis in the modern era confirmed that he was the child of a full sibling royal pair, which in part explains some of the health issues historians have speculated about, like a clubfoot scoliosis and a weakened immune system. Royal inbreeding might have preserved power, but it didn't do much for the gene pool. Still, these marriages were official, often symbolic, and sometimes repeated generation after generation. Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra technically married both of her younger brothers. That was the tradition. Though in practice, she ruled solo or alongside Roman consorts like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who thankfully were not blood relatives. Cleopatra clearly understood optics, and she also understood when to sidestep tradition for the sake of practicality, or politics, or survival. But don't worry, this wasn't standard practice across Egyptian society. The sibling marriage trend was almost entirely confined to the royal family. For everyone else, farmers, artisans, merchants, marrying your sister was just as weird as it sounds today. Commoners generally married outside their immediate family, choosing spouses from neighboring households, villages, or social groups. Cousin marriage might have happened in rural areas, but full-on sibling unions, that was reserved for the people who wore gold sandals and had elaborate tombs shaped like pyramids. Among nobles and elites, things could still get complicated. Political alliances often dictated marriage decisions. Sometimes a young noblewoman would be married off to an older relative to secure land rights. Occasionally, a widow would marry her late husband's brother to keep estates intact. These arrangements weren't driven by passion. They were administrative solutions wrapped in ceremonial clothing. And yes, there were consequences. The repeated merging of genetic material led to some tragic outcomes, especially in the later dynasties. High infant mortality, genetic disorders, and shortened lifespans among royalty suggest that divine imitation didn't always produce divine results. The gods, it turns out, could get away with things humans could not. So why did they keep doing it? Because power is stubborn, tradition is persuasive, and when your legitimacy rests on being the child of gods, you don't risk weakening that claim with an outsider, even if it means marrying your sister, or your niece, or both at the same time. It happened. Of course, not all royal marriages were strictly sibling-based. Some pharaohs married noblewomen, foreign princesses, or multiple wives from different regions. These unions helped solidify political alliances, establish trade, and appease various power blocs. But the primary wife, the great royal wife, was often a sister or close relative, chosen to preserve the illusion of divine order. It's worth noting that Egyptian mythology never shamed the gods for their romantic choices. There was no divine judgment about sibling marriages, no myths of punishment or taboo. The gods modeled harmony, not moral panic. The idea that love had to follow a rigid societal script simply didn't apply to deities or their pharaonic avatars. Modern readers, of course, can't help but recoil, and rightly so. From today's perspective, the practice is disturbing, but in ancient Egypt, it wasn't seen through the same lens. It was logical, if deeply flawed, a kind of cosmic bookkeeping wrapped in linen and incense, and it wasn't forever. As dynasties shifted and outside influences grew, especially during periods of Greek and Roman control, the tradition began to fade. Practicality and new cultural norms eventually outweighed the allure of divine mimicry. Still, the legacy lingers. When we think of ancient Egypt's most iconic rulers, many were products of these tangled family lines. Their stories, both triumphs and tragedies, were shaped by a system that placed cosmic imitation above biological caution. So the next time someone tells you Cleopatra married her brother, you can nod sigh and say yes. And no, it wasn't romantic. It was Egyptian politics. And then maybe offer them a nice, normal, genetically diverse salad. No lettuce symbolism this time. For all the divine drama of pharaohs and gods, most ancient Egyptians weren't sculpting magical phalluses or arranging royal sibling marriages. They were just ordinary people trying to live their lives between seasonal floods, sandstorms, and the occasional nosy neighbor. And amid that dusty, demanding routine, they still found time for intimacy, affection, and the kind of slow burn romance that unfolds between a basket of onions and a batch of freshly baked bread. If you were a farmer in ancient Egypt, your day started early, often before the sun rose over the Nile. There were fields to tend animals, to feed grain to thresh, and probably a small child already tangled in your linen sash. Life was busy, but even in the hum of chores and the rhythm of daily survival, relationships bloomed. A look passed between two people in the grain fields, a shared water jug, a laugh at market. Intimacy wasn't rare, it was part of life, and it didn't require a feast or a full moon, just a moment when the goats weren't screaming and the children were finally asleep. Most couples shared sleeping quarters, usually a single room with mats or raised beds made of palm slats. There was a little privacy, and the walls were thin, but that didn't mean romance was absent. In fact, tomb paintings and household inscriptions show a surprising level of tenderness between husbands and wives. Some show couples standing close, touching affectionately, even embracing face to face. These weren't stiff, formal portraits. They were expressions of genuine human connection, and not everything had to be hidden. While modesty certainly existed, ancient Egyptian society wasn't obsessed with concealing affection. A husband resting his hand on his wife's shoulder in public wouldn't trigger scandal. In fact, it might be seen as a sign of harmony, a good omen that the household was balanced and blessed. But remember, relationships were practical, yes, but they were also emotional. Love wasn't just the stuff of poems or palace gossip. It was found in shared labor, in the way someone seasoned the lentils just right, in the relief of knowing someone else would help haul the grain baskets, in the softness of a linen tunic folded neatly at the end of the bed after a long day under the sun. There were no dating apps, but there were festivals. Community events tied to religious calendars were great excuses for mingling, dressing up, wearing extra perfume, and sharing bread with someone interesting. Temples might host gatherings where music and dance filled the air. And under the watchful eyes of gods like Hathor, flirtation and courtship were not only accepted, they were encouraged. Songs and jokes were passed between lovers, sometimes scribbled on bits of pottery. These weren't grand literary compositions, just quick notes, everyday poetry for everyday people. A man might compare his lover's voice to beer. A woman might write of dreaming about the boy who walks past her house every morning. It was intimate, grounded, and very human. Less Sonnet 18. More I see you every day, and my heart forgets how to sweep. Work and love were intertwined. In artisan communities like Deir el Medina, where workers built the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, records show marriages, divorces, affairs, and gossip in a flurry of hieratic script. These were not faceless workers. They were men and women with complex emotional lives. They filed complaints, wrote love notes, and even held small ceremonies marking partnerships. You can almost hear the whispered conversations over dinner and the side eyes when someone didn't come home from the quarry right away. And if relationships went sour, there was room for that too. Divorce, as mentioned earlier, was possible and not necessarily shameful. If love faded or compatibility frayed, couples could separate, divide their property, and move on. Children usually stayed with the mother. And the gods, as always, were there to oversee, not judge, but observe, ensure that Maat was restored. Balance, even after heartbreak. Interestingly, fertility was treated with respect, but not desperation. If a couple struggled to conceive, they might consult a midwife, seek a magical amulet, or perform a ritual to a goddess like Hathor or Taweret. There was effort, but also patience, a recognition that the body had its own rhythms, and that sometimes, no matter how many spells or honey infusions you tried, things took time. Contraception existed too. Natural methods like acacia, gum crocodile, dung, yes, again, and herbal mixtures were used to manage family size. These weren't secretive or shameful. They were part of daily knowledge passed between women, midwives, and healers. The idea that sexuality and reproduction needed to be separated by layers of bureaucracy or dogma hadn't yet taken hold. So what did a normal love life look like in ancient Egypt? It looked like shared meals, mutual respect, occasional arguments about chores, quiet laughter by oil lamplight. It looked like two people raising children enduring hardship and still finding time to hold hands when no one was watching. It wasn't mythic. It wasn't melodramatic. It was, in a word, human. And in a world of flooding rivers, powerful sun gods, and tombs filled with golden treasures, maybe the most enduring treasure of all was the quiet, ordinary intimacy of people who loved each other in the middle of it all and didn't need a single monument to prove it. So what happened when ancient Egyptians wanted to avoid adding another little mouth to feed? Well, they didn't just cross their fingers and hope for the best. They had methods. Some were practical, some were herbal, and some, let's be honest, belonged in the don't try this at home category. But all of them reveal something fascinating, that people in ancient Egypt weren't naive about fertility. They understood it, experimented with it, and treated it with the same blend of magic and medicine they applied to nearly everything else. Let's begin with one of their favorites, honey. Sweet, sticky, and antibacterial honey was more than just a treat to spread on your flat bread. It was also believed to be an effective contraceptive when inserted into the body, usually mixed with ground dates and sometimes combined with acacia resin. This blend was packed into a kind of soft paste or pessary and used to line the cervix. Surprisingly, acacia does contain lactic acid, which might actually have had some mild sperm inhibiting properties. Ancient science occasionally onto something. And then there's the infamous crocodile dung. Yes, really. Some ancient texts suggest that dried crocodile excrement was formed into a paste and used in similar fashion as a barrier method. Why possibly? Because it was thick, absorbent, and symbolic. Crocodiles were powerful, dangerous, and linked to certain fertility gods. So by invoking the animal's essence, you were also calling on divine protection, while also hoping, presumably, that you didn't develop a terrible infection, because sanitation wasn't exactly their strong suit. It's worth noting that not every Egyptian woman used these methods. Contraception wasn't standardized, and knowledge of ingredients likely varied by region, class, and access to healers. Wealthy women might have had access to more refined ingredients and professional midwives, while poorer households relied on oral tradition folk, recipes, and a fair amount of improvisation. There were also behavioral methods, timing, withdrawal, abstinence, during certain parts of the lunar cycle. And while we don't have detailed medical diaries from farmers and fisherfolk, the survival of so many herbal recipes suggests that fertility management was actively pursued by everyday people, not just elites. Beyond preventing pregnancy, Egyptians also used rituals and herbal remedies to boost fertility when needed. Concoctions containing lettuce carob beer or various flowers were ingested, burned, or rubbed on the body to help encourage conception. The symbolism here was strong. Lettuce, for instance, was sacred to the god Min, who, as we now know, didn't exactly whisper his associations with subtlety. Lettuce stood tall, grew fast, and released a milky sap when cut. You get the picture. In temple offerings and fertility rites, women sometimes carried bundles of this lettuce or placed it near altars to Min in hopes of increased virility or conception. One might imagine a priest quietly handing over a particularly lush stalk with a nod and a cryptic, "May the god bless your house tonight." The Egyptians also believed in sympathetic magic. If you wanted to increase your fertility, you might sleep with a fertility figurine under your pillow, or wear an amulet shaped like Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. These items weren't just spiritual, they were functional emotional anchors, a way to feel empowered and proactive in a world where nature didn't always cooperate. Pregnancy tests existed too, sort of. One method involved urinating on a mix of wheat and barley seeds. If the grains sprouted within a few days, the woman was pregnant. Some sources claim the type of seed that grew could even predict the baby's sex. It sounds like superstition, but modern experiments have shown that estrogen in pregnant urine can indeed encourage seed germination. Once again, ancient instincts weren't entirely off the mark. So where does all this lead us? To a simple conclusion: Egyptians weren't passive about their reproductive lives. They didn't shrug and leave it up to fate. They tracked cycles. They experimented with nature. They turned to magic and medicine in equal measure. And whether they were trying to conceive, prevent conception, or just keep their households manageable in a land where grain was currency, they did it with creativity and care. This wasn't about shame or secrecy. It was about practicality. Family size mattered, resources were finite, and childbearing was risky. Mortality rates were high, midwives were essential, and motherhood, though respected, was no small undertaking. So choosing when and whether to have children was a deeply human concern, one handled with as much knowledge as they could muster, given the tools and beliefs of their time. And again, they did it without shame. The female body was not something to be hidden, feared, or regulated into silence. It was part of life's rhythm. Pregnancy, menstruation, breastfeeding, and menopause all had their place in Egyptian thought. No purity codes, no exile tents, just a society that, while not perfect, was impressively unbothered by the reality of biology. So whether it was a bowl of honey and dates or a ritual with incense and lettuce, the Egyptians approached fertility with a blend of pragmatism, reverence, and occasionally very questionable hygiene. But one thing's clear: they paid attention, they took it seriously, and they left behind enough quirky recipes and magic scrolls to keep future historians both fascinated and mildly horrified. And honestly, isn't that what history's all about? If you think romance in ancient Egypt was all practicality and ritual, allow the love poetry to change your mind. Because these people didn't just flirt with flowers and exchange grain baskets, they wrote about it extensively, tenderly, and sometimes with surprising spice. Their poetry was filled with longing joy, frustration, and metaphors that ran the gamut from sweet to suggestive, with a heavy emphasis on garden skis. And you guessed it, lettuce. These love poems weren't hidden in royal vaults or scribed by elite scholars. They were often written by ordinary people, etched onto pottery fragments, tucked into private letters, or composed as songs. Many have survived from the New Kingdom period, roughly 1300 BC, and they reveal a culture where romance was not only present, it was celebrated. One popular motif, the garden. No surprise given the importance of fertility and nature. A lover might compare their beloved's scent to blossoming myrrh, or describe their rendezvous in a garden where sycamores shielded them from the burning sun. Gardens weren't just literal places, they were metaphors for desire. One woman writes of her body as a pool of cool water inviting her beloved to dive in. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Another favorite birds, especially geese. They weren't just livestock, they symbolized affection and sometimes outright seduction. One poem describes a girl who can't concentrate because of the goose that flutters near her, clearly not a reference to actual waterfowl. The geese were doing metaphorical laps around the pond of her imagination. And then there's the beer. Egyptians loved their beer. It was nutritious, hydrating, and brewed everywhere from temple courtyards to backyards. Naturally, beer made its way into love poetry. A man might compare his partner's presence to the feeling of being intoxicated by her smile. A woman might write that her lover's kiss outweighs 1,000 beers, which, if you know how much beer Egyptians drank, is the ancient equivalent of "you're better than a lifetime Netflix subscription." The poems were rarely shy. Some were downright sultry, and some walked the line of polite euphemism with phrases like, "He plows my fields," or "I rest in his arms until dawn." But the tone was never crude. It was playful, expressive, and emotionally open. Egyptians didn't bury their feelings beneath layers of stoic restraint. They celebrated them. Take this verse, written from a young woman's perspective. It is her love that gives me strength. It is she who makes me walk on water. My heart swells when I see her. My arms long to embrace her. Or this cheeky admission, I made my way past his door. I didn't knock. But oh, I meant to. These aren't just historical relics. They're little love notes from the past. They remind us that people thousands of years ago felt the same butterflies, endured the same awkward silences, and scribbled the same hesitant verses when words felt too fragile to speak aloud. Poetry wasn't the only medium for romance either. Tokens of affection, like rings, amulets, or cosmetics, might be exchanged between lovers. A man might gift a finely scented oil. A woman might give a hand-woven sash. Even humble objects took on symbolic weight when shared with the right intention. The difference between a jar of beer and a jar of your beer was everything. Writing was a central part of intimacy. Literacy wasn't universal, but among scribes, artisans, and temple workers, writing was a way to court, confess, and sometimes beg for forgiveness. Ostraca, those broken pieces of pottery used for casual notes, were like the sticky notes of the ancient world. Thinking of you. Your smile is like lotus blossoms, Please return my coat and stop ignoring me. Even official documents occasionally reveal the emotional undercurrents of relationships. Marriage contracts could include gentle terms about kindness, fairness, and fidelity, not just property rights. Divorce documents sometimes included notes about the cause: one spouse's neglect, another's broken promise to share household labor. It wasn't all transactional, it was personal. For the ancient Egyptians, the heart wasn't just a metaphor, it was literal. They believed it was the seat of emotion, intellect, and morality. At judgment in the afterlife, your heart was weighed against the feather of marred truth and balance. If it was too heavy with sin or regret, your soul couldn't continue. So to speak of love from the heart wasn't poetic fluff. It was a sacred declaration. Love had cosmic consequences. Romantic longing could be overwhelming too. Some poems describe the physical ache of missing someone, sleepless nights, restless dreams, the torment of seeing your beloved from afar but not being able to speak. If ancient Egyptians had invented the love song, Adele would have had serious competition. And all of it, every note, every metaphor, every awkward pottery, love letter, points to one core truth. The Egyptians didn't just endure their emotions, they expressed them publicly, joyfully, sometimes through lettuce-shaped offerings, sometimes through sweaty verses scratched with reed pens. So next time you find yourself hesitating over a text message or a scribbled Valentine's note, just remember somewhere, 3,000 years ago, someone was doing the exact same thing, except with geese metaphors and zero punctuation. And frankly, that's kind of beautiful. Let's shift our gaze now to the women of ancient Egypt, not as poetic muses or quiet homemakers, but as full participants in the world of love law and libido. Because contrary to what many might assume, Egyptian women had power, not just in the home, but in the bedroom, the marketplace, and yes, the courtroom. And when it came to matters of sex and marriage, they weren't just passive background figures. They could own, choose refuse, and occasionally terrify. To begin with, a woman in ancient Egypt could own property. Let that sink in. She could inherit land from her parents, buy and sell goods, and leave property to her children in a will. Married or unmarried, rich or working class, she could conduct business in her own name without needing a male co-signer. If her husband misused family resources, she could take legal action. That's more freedom than many women had in 18th century Europe, let alone 1300 BCE. And while marriage was common, it wasn't compulsory. A woman didn't need to marry to gain status or protection. She could live independently, raise children, and run a household solo if needed. And if she did marry, she retained her legal identity. That is, she didn't become her husband's property. The linens in the back room, still hers. The goats, hers. The house, if she brought it into the marriage. You guessed it, of course. These rights didn't guarantee emotional bliss. Egyptian society had its share of double standards, especially when it came to fidelity. A man could take multiple wives or concubines, especially if he was wealthy. A woman, not so much. But that didn't mean women were powerless. Far from it. If a husband cheated or mistreated his wife, she could sue him. If he failed to provide food, clothing, or protection, things often outlined in the marriage agreement, she could seek divorce. And the terms were usually in her favor. She often retained custody of the children, her personal property, and in some cases, even a chunk of his estate. Pharaohs may have ruled the land, but in a domestic dispute, a determined wife with a reed pen and legal backing could be just as formidable. Take, for instance, a woman named Naunacht, who lived during the New Kingdom. We know about her because she left behind a will, a detailed, assertive, no-nonsense will, in which she named the children she wanted to inherit her property, and the ones she absolutely did not. She specifically excluded certain offspring who had failed to care for her in old age. Cold, maybe. Empowered, absolutely. Women also had say in love. Courtship could be mutual. Many love poems were written from the perspective of women expressing desire, frustration, and bold invitations. One verse reads, "If only he would see me, if only I could be his beer and quench his thirst." That's not coy, that's confident. Egyptian women weren't trained to be silent or chaste. They were taught to be partners, providers, and participants. In religious life, women held roles as priestesses, musicians, and temple administrators. The most powerful of these was the god's wife of Amun, a title that came with wealthland and influence, usually reserved for royal women. Even outside the temple, women served as midwives, physicians, and professional mourners, a more respected role than it sounds. In the bedroom, their pleasure was acknowledged. Art, poetry, and medical texts indicate that female desire was not taboo. Midwives and healers recorded ways to increase intimacy, restore libido, and soothe pain. Some texts even discuss positions that were more comfortable for the woman during pregnancy. That's a level of consideration rarely seen in many ancient sources. And if you think Egyptian women just grinned and bore it when things went wrong, think again. There are records of curses issued by wives against unfaithful husbands, not in back alleys, but in writing. "May your limbs tremble," one line reads. "May your seed dry like clay." A little harsh, perhaps, but a poetic way to say, "You'll regret this." Some women even leveraged magic to maintain or regain a lover's affection. Love spells weren't uncommon. They could involve figurines, incense, or reciting charms under the moonlight. One preserved scroll contains a spell designed to bind the heart of the man so that he thinks of no one but me. Ancient love magic part passion, part persistence. Of course, all this varied depending on class and location. A noblewoman had more resources than a farmer's daughter. An educated scribe's wife had more legal knowledge than a goat herder's spouse. But the underlying rights, the legal framework that allowed women to act, choose, and reject, was embedded in Egyptian society more firmly than in many later cultures. That said, men still held the majority of public power. Pharaohs were mostly male. Government roles, military ranks, and large-scale religious ceremonies were male-dominated. But within their spheres, home courtship, healing birth, women had clout. And they used it. There's even speculation that the famed female orgasm wasn't entirely unknown or ignored. Some texts hint at its acknowledgement in medical or spiritual contexts, though it was never the focus. Still, the simple fact that female pleasure was not considered taboo or even particularly noteworthy speaks volumes. In short, Egyptian women weren't just bystanders in their own love lives. They were authors both figuratively and sometimes literally. They ran homes, filed complaints, penned poetry, brewed beer, and yes, occasionally dropped a divine level curse on an ex who got too cozy with the neighbor. So the next time someone tries to tell you ancient women had no agency, gently point them toward Egypt, hand them a copy of Naunacht's will, and say, she disinherited half her kids and didn't blink. Let's talk about fertility statues, protective hippo goddesses, and magical wands shaped like cobras. Because in ancient Egypt, childbirth was not just a medical event, it was a divine performance. When a woman was pregnant, she wasn't simply expecting, she was participating in a sacred process that involved gods, midwives, amulets, and a healthy respect for things that slithered. Pregnancy was seen as both a blessing and a vulnerability. On one hand, it was proof that the gods were pleased that the household was prosperous and that the family line would continue. On the other, it was a risky business. No painkillers, no prenatal vitamins. And the Nile's flooding schedule didn't exactly coordinate with due dates. So Egyptians approached childbirth like they approached most of life's big moments, with a blend of superstition ritual and practical support. Let's start with the goddesses. The superstar of fertility and childbirth was Taweret, the hippo-bodied, lion-footed, croc-tailed protector of mothers and babies. She might not have looked cuddly, what with her giant snout and sagging belly, but she was beloved. Taweret was the ultimate mama bear, fierce, protective, and always watching. Her statues lined bedroom shelves, her image adorned amulets, and her presence was invoked in birthing rituals. Pregnant women clutched her likeness like a sacred teddy bear. Close behind was Bes, a squat, bow-legged dwarf god with lion features and a flair for wild dancing. He was the hype man of childbirth. Bes wasn't graceful. He stuck out his tongue, jangled tambourines, and wore feathered headdresses, but he got the job done. Egyptians believed he could scare away evil spirits with his chaotic energy, and during labor, women wore Bes amulets or painted his image on their walls for protection and comic relief. Nothing says push like a grinning dwarf god shaking a tambourine at your feet. Childbirth rituals often took place in a special birthing room or sometimes a temporary structure built for the event known as a mamacy, literally a birth house. These weren't hospitals, but ritual spaces, places filled with incense chants, midwives, and a good supply of prayers. Midwives were the true heroes of the moment. Trained through experience and oral tradition, they knew the signs, the sounds, and the swift decisions needed when things got complicated. They massaged bellies, murmured encouragements, and applied herbal compresses. Some texts mention the use of date wine to dull pain, not quite epidural level relief, but probably a welcome distraction. And then there were the magical tools. Wands carved from hippo tusks called birth tusks, or magic wands were inscribed with protective symbols and used to draw circles of safety around the laboring woman. These weren't subtle. They featured lions, snakes, frogs, and deities mid-roar. The idea was clear no evil spirit in their right mind would dare cross this chaotic animal parade. If childbirth was going to be loud, so was the defense. Amulets were also essential. The Eye of Horus protected both mother and newborn. Scarab charms promoted rebirth and good fortune. And Isis knots, tied from red thread, symbolized healing and divine maternal care. These were worn buried in bedding or tied to door frames. You didn't give birth in ancient Egypt without your accessory game on point. Naming the child came shortly after birth. There was no official ceremony, but names were chosen with care. Many were theophoric, meaning they invoked a god's name, like Meriamun beloved of Amun or Hori of Horus. Others reflected aspirations, strength, beauty, longevity. You could think of it as a hopeful hashtag. Healthy, protected, no snakes please. As for breastfeeding, it was the norm, and it came with its own set of beliefs. The goddess Isis was often depicted nursing baby Horus, setting the divine standard. Breast milk was seen as a life force, and wet nurses were respected figures in wealthier households. If a mother couldn't nurse, a professional would step in not just to feed the child, but to pass on spiritual protection through the milk itself. The postnatal period was one of healing and caution. The mother was considered open and vulnerable to malevolent forces, so households doubled down on protection. Herbs like fenugreek, caraway, and coriander were used in poultices. Prayers were offered to ward off fevers, and the new mother might avoid certain activities or foods until she was deemed restored. And what about the babies themselves, swaddled tightly in linen? They were sometimes anointed with oils and perfumes, carried in reed baskets, and absolutely showered in amulets. They had little protection against sandstorms, hippos, or invasive cats, so the more charms, the better. Safety, after all, was as much about divine favor as practical caretaking. Infant mortality was high. The average life expectancy was low. But these realities didn't diminish the love Egyptians had for their children. Tomb paintings show parents holding toddlers, playing games, teaching them to fish or carry baskets. Children were joy, mischievous, sticky, and treasured. And when one was lost, mourning was profound. The dead were honored, named in prayers, and sometimes depicted in family tombs to ensure they were remembered as part of the household forever. So yes, childbirth was raw, messy, and dangerous. But it was also sacred. The moment of a new life entering the world was seen as a continuation of divine cycles. A mother wasn't just a vessel, she was part priestess, part warrior, part living miracle. And through it all, through contractions, chanting midwives, and the gleeful shrieking of Bess, there remained one unshakable truth. Bringing life into the world was an act of power, not just for the gods, but for every woman who bore the weight of that miracle on her back, in her belly, and in her heart. Now that we've swaddled the babies and calmed Bess down, let's zoom out a bit and talk about the grander stage of sexuality in ancient Egypt, not just in homes and gardens, but on the temple walls, in tomb inscriptions, and scattered across myths, where gods got a little too enthusiastic with cosmic affection. Because in Egypt, sex wasn't just private, it was everywhere in paint, in stone, and even in political power plays. To start with, Egyptian temples and tombs were not shy. While most were solemn places dedicated to the divine, you could still find the occasional eyebrow-raising illustration, or at least something that makes modern archaeologists glance over their shoulders before taking a photo. The most famous example, the Turin erotic papyrus, sometimes dubbed the world's first adult comic book. It's a wildly explicit satirical scroll that depicts exaggerated sexual scenes alongside clumsy acrobatics and oddly confident hairstyles. It wasn't meant to be sacred scripture. Scholars believe it was a kind of parody, a cheeky piece created for amusement, perhaps passed around like an inside joke among scribes. But even if it was meant to entertain the papyrus, tells us something important. Sexuality wasn't taboo. Even when it was being mocked, it was being discussed, laughed about, normalized. Of course, most formal art stayed within certain bounds. Elite tombs focused on family harmony, prosperity, and scenes of daily life. But even those could hint at intimacy, loving glances, arms gently draped couples walking close together. Subtle cues, but clearly affectionate. And when fertility needed to be emphasized, say in a depiction of a couple hoping for children, you might see suggestive fruit intertwined vines, or the obligatory lotus flower blooming at precisely the right moment. Sexual symbolism also soaked into architecture and iconography. The obelisk, yes, it was a symbol of the sun god, Ra, and cosmic stability. But its shape didn't go unnoticed. In some traditions, its vertical thrust represented male generative power rising toward the heavens in eternal tribute. Same goes for the sacred beetle, the scarab. It represented rebirth and transformation, sure, but it also laid its eggs in dung and pushed them along like a cosmic delivery service. Life was messy. The Egyptians didn't flinch. Even the gods got in on the action. Egyptian mythology is filled with stories that, when you read them carefully, are basically just divine soap operas. Take the story of Geb and Nut, the earth and sky deities. They were lovers wrapped around each other so tightly that the sun couldn't move through. The god Shu eventually had to pry them apart, lifting Nut into the sky and pressing Geb to the ground. Tragic, yes, but also a very poetic description of separation after some celestial spooning. And then there's Set and Osiris, a rivalry that involved jealousy, murder, and depending on the version, some questionable anatomical mischief. After killing Osiris and scattering his body parts across Egypt, Set ensured that Osiris's reproductive organ was lost to the Nile. Isis, ever determined, gathered the pieces and reassembled her husband. She couldn't find that one last part, though, so she crafted a replacement, often said to be made of gold, and brought Osiris back long enough to conceive Horus. Imagine explaining that family tree at a reunion. These myths weren't whispered behind hands. They were carved into temple walls, recited in ceremonies, and used to teach lessons about loyalty, life, and divine continuity. They weren't considered indecent. They were cosmic. Fertility, desire, even chaos, all had their place in the divine order. Nothing was left in the dark. Priests and priestesses, too, had to navigate sexuality as part of their religious roles. Some cults required celibacy, especially those dedicated to Osiris or Amun. Others embraced ritualized sexuality, particularly in festivals honoring Hathor or Min. In the annual festival of drunkenness, participants drank, copiously danced, and entered ecstatic states in hopes of connecting with Hathor's divine joy. It wasn't a frat party, it was sacred revelry, designed to bring people closer to the divine through pleasure abandon and a sense of collective release. In some temples, sacred marriages were reenacted between priests and priestesses, acting out the union of gods through symbolic or, in speculative cases, physical rituals. These ceremonies aimed to renew the land's fertility, align the kingdom with cosmic order, and remind everyone that even the gods needed a date night now and then. Sex was not just biological, it was cosmological. It was woven into the very concept of creation. The universe, according to some myths, was born when the god Atum brought himself into being, and then produced offspring through a highly personal ritual involving his own hand. That's right. The Big Bang Egyptian edition featured a solo performance and zero shame. Artem was applauded, not scolded. And that's the key difference. The Egyptians didn't overlay sex with sin. There were no notions of original guilt or bodily shame. There was reverence, yes, but also realism. People desired, gods created. Life emerged from unions of love, lust magic, and occasional comedic mishaps. So whether it was a scribbled joke on a papyrus scroll, a solemn temple carving of nut arched over the stars, or a golden replacement phallus helping to resurrect a murdered god's sexuality in ancient Egypt, was many things sacred, funny, symbolic, powerful. And if you were an ancient Egyptian lying in bed beneath the stars, you didn't need to blush at the idea of desire. You could simply look up at Nut's sparkling body across the sky and know even the heavens once knew what it was to be tangled in love. If the gods were allowed to be flirty, creative, and even a little chaotic with their affections, then surely love in the afterlife had a place too. Because for the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end of desire. In fact, it might just have been the beginning of your eternal honeymoon. The afterlife wasn't some chilly, cloud-filled waiting room. It was lush, warm, fertile, and apparently kind of romantic. To understand this, we have to revisit the Egyptian vision of the afterlife, the field of reeds, or Aru. Imagine it, a glorious landscape of endless green, calm rivers, golden sunlight that never scorches, and every meal is a feast without cooking or cleanup. For the average Egyptian, this wasn't a fantasy, it was the ultimate goal. And it wasn't to be spent alone. Tomb inscriptions often show husbands and wives together in the afterlife, tending fields, side by side, sharing food, exchanging glances. It's domestic bliss, but eternal. No rush, no taxes, no nosy in-laws, just you, your partner, and a boatload of lotus blossoms. This wasn't just sentimental. The ancient Egyptians went out of their way to ensure that their loved ones would meet again after death. Tombs were prepared with double sarcophagi. Inscriptions often included the phrase, united with spouse's name in eternity. Even humble graves might feature depictions of a couple sitting together, forever young, forever in love. And these weren't stiff formal portraits either. Some tomb paintings show couples walking hand in hand, embracing or sharing what looks suspiciously like a playful smirk. They weren't afraid to depict affection beyond the veil. In many tombs, the husbands' and wives' faces are turned toward each other, an unusual move given the rigid conventions of Egyptian art. But it meant something. This is who I want to face forever. Imagine carving that into stone as your final wish. But what about, say, if your afterlife was complicated? Divorce existed in life, so what happened in death? We don't have conclusive evidence, but there are a few amusing theories. Some believe that whoever paid for the tomb got the final say in who appeared beside them. So if a husband remarried late in life, but his first wife funded the burial plot, guess who's getting that stone-carved cuddle in the underworld? Love may be eternal, but so is pettiness. There's also the matter of tomb letters. These were notes written by the living to the deceased, asking for help with matters of health, justice, or even romantic problems. One letter from a widow to her dead husband reads like a mix of longing and light scolding. Why do you not help me in court as you promised? Have you forgotten me? It's oddly relatable, like texting your ex who still has your Netflix login. But the most touching thing, these letters often ended with expressions of continued love. Even in frustration, the bonds remained. The dead were expected to care for their spouses, to intercede with the gods, to send dreams or omens. Death didn't erase love, it stretched it out across dimensions. Love spells were also sometimes designed to work across the grave. In rare cases, individuals called upon gods to reunite them with a lost partner or to draw their spirit near. It's hard to say whether this was purely emotional or slightly ghostly, but the intent was clear. I still want you, even now. And while marriage wasn't a requirement for entry into the afterlife, it certainly sweetened the idea. Being alone in paradise didn't sound ideal. Companionship, as in life, was part of what made the next world complete. Some even believed that sexual pleasure continued in the field of reeds, while there's no papyrus titled Afterlife Intimacy. One-to-one clues in funerary texts and art suggest that physical affection, embracing, kissing, even the implication of more, was part of eternal joy. Why not? If beer flowed freely and your favorite pets were resurrected, surely a little cuddling under the sycamore tree wasn't out of the question. Of course, fertility wasn't a concern anymore. In the afterlife, nobody aged, nobody gave birth, and nobody needed contraception. Desire existed purely for connection, for the pleasure of presence, the comfort of shared memory. It wasn't reproductive, it was relational. Even the gods modeled this. Osiris and Isis, despite death, remained united. Their myth reinforced the idea that love outlasts mortality. Isis didn't remarry. She remained devoted. She traveled the world to recover Osiris's body, grieved him, resurrected him, and conceived their child. If that's not commitment, I don't know what is. The belief in eternal partnership also encouraged people to behave kindly in marriage. A spouse's actions in life were believed to affect their status in the afterlife. Treat your partner cruelly. You might face judgment, not just from the gods, but from your partner, who might have a lot to say at your heart-weighing ceremony. So the next time someone says, ancient history was all arranged marriages and dusty rituals, you can tell them that 3,000 years ago, someone was decorating their tomb with love poetry and asking the gods to let them wake up next to their partner forever. Because in ancient Egypt, love didn't die with the body. It just moved to the next room. Of course, no exploration of ancient Egyptian sexuality would be complete without diving into the tangled and occasionally eyebrow-raising love lives of the pharaohs. Because while the common folk were sharing poems and brewing beer for their sweethearts, the royals were, well, keeping things in the family, quite literally. Let's begin with the infamous concept of royal incest. To us, the idea of marrying your sibling is a hard no. But to the ancient Egyptian elite, it made a certain cosmic sense. Pharaohs weren't just kings, they were gods on earth, living incarnations of Horus and sons of Ra. And the gods, as we've established, had some very close family dynamics. Isis and Osiris were brother and sister and husband and wife. So to keep divine bloodlines, pure pharaohs mimicked this tradition, marrying sisters, half-sisters, and occasionally daughters. Before we start pointing fingers, let's remember, this wasn't a free-for-all. These marriages were typically symbolic, designed to secure legitimacy, consolidate power, and reinforce religious traditions. Not all sibling marriages were physical unions. Sometimes a royal sister was queen in title only with no romantic involvement. But other times, yep, it was as literal as it sounds. Take Tutankhamun, the boy king of gold mask fame. His parents were siblings. He himself married his half-sister, Ankhesenamun. The consequences, likely genetic complications. Modern scans of his mummified remains suggest he suffered from health issues, possibly due to inbreeding. But at the time, this wasn't scandalous. It was sacred. Strange by today's standards, but to them it was aligning with the gods. Pharaohs didn't just marry their sisters. Many had multiple wives, concubines, and what might best be described as diplomatic entanglements. Royal women from neighboring regions were often sent as part of peace treaties or trade alliances. Marrying a foreign princess could cement ties with another kingdom and conveniently add a few new dancing girls to the palace harem. The harem, by the way, wasn't just a dimly lit room full of lounging women. It was an entire institution, a kind of gated royal village, complete with kitchens, gardens, servants, and security. The women, often dozens or even hundreds, ranged from noble-born consorts to servants and entertainers. Some bore children. Others managed the complex social network of the palace. It wasn't all romance and perfume. It was politics, competition, and survival. These royal arrangements could get messy. Jealousy, succession disputes, and behind-the-curtain power plays were constant concerns. One famous scandal involves Queen Tiye, the powerful wife of Amenhotep III and mother of Akhenaten. Tiye wasn't of royal blood, yet she held immense influence, often depicted sitting at equal height with her husband, a rare sign of status. When her son Akhenaten came to power and launched a radical religious revolution, Hello Monotheism, Tiye stayed close. Some speculate she helped him rule from behind the scenes. Others whisper rumors of incestuous relationships within the family. Akhenaten may have fathered children with multiple sisters. The records are vague and the art is stylized, but the family tree does start to resemble a spiral staircase after a while. And then there's Ramses II, one of the most famous pharaohs in history. He ruled for over 60 years, had more than 100 children, and built temples so grand they could humble a thunderstorm. He married multiple women, including at least 2 of his daughters. Again, the purpose was symbolic. These daughter wives were often given titles like Great Royal Wife to solidify their roles in temple ceremonies. Whether the relationships were consummated is debated, but the optics were clear. This was about divine continuity. Still, not every royal love story was tangled in bloodlines and political necessity. Some had moments of genuine affection. Nefertari, Ramses II's favorite queen, was honored with her own spectacular tomb, lavishly painted, filled with personal inscriptions, and described as she for whom the sun rises. That's not just ceremony. That's a man who liked his wife a lot. Royal women could hold extraordinary power. Some even ruled outright. Hatshepsut, for example, declared herself pharaoh and wore the ceremonial beard to prove it. Her reign was prosperous, and she likely chose not to remarry in order to maintain her grip on power. And while she may not have made waves with her romantic life, she showed that women could lead Egypt just as firmly as men, no husband required. The drama didn't stop in life either. In death, royal relationships could still cause confusion. Tombs were reassigned. Names were chiseled out or rewritten. Pharaohs who fell from favor had their images defaced, their lovers erased, and their family lines rewritten like ancient PR campaigns. Take Akhenaten. Again, after his death, the new regime went to great lengths to scrub his legacy, including the records of his radical religious ideas and his eccentric family structure. His wife, Nefertiti, once a glamorous queen, vanished from the records in her final years, leading to centuries of speculation. Did she die? Rule under another name? Fake her own death? And start a minimalist design company? We may never know. But what's clear is that royal relationships were rarely simple. They were spiritual, strategic, and on more than one occasion, scandalous enough to fill an entire season of historical reality TV. So when we think of ancient Egyptian sex and romance, we shouldn't just picture garden strolls and beer-fueled serenades. We should also picture court intrigue, political marriages, and family reunions that required a lot of name tags. Because when love and power are wrapped around the same golden crook and flail, things are bound to get complicated. As we come to the final chapter of our journey through ancient Egyptian intimacy, it's time to talk about how all of this, the love, the laughter, the magic ointments, the divine awkwardness was preserved, how we know what we know, and why thousands of years later, we are still peeking into the papyrus pages of their personal lives with a mix of curiosity, awe, and the occasional raised eyebrow. Because here's the thing, ancient Egyptians weren't trying to keep any of this a secret. They wrote it down, they painted it, they carved it into walls, they told stories that were meant to last forever. And somehow, thanks to sand tombs and the accidental heroics of grave robbers and archaeologists, much of it survived. One of our most insightful sources, medical papyri, the Kahun gynecological papyrus, for example, dates to around 1800 BCE and contains detailed observations about female anatomy, fertility, and reproductive health. It discusses contraceptive methods, aloe, honey, and acacia, pregnancy diagnoses, the wheat and barley test, and treatments for issues like uterine displacement. Is it scientific by modern standards? Not exactly, but it's practical, observational, and deeply respectful of the female body. Then there are the ostraca, those little chips of broken pottery used like post-it notes. These are where we find casual notes, practice texts from scribes, and even the occasional doodle. Some contain love poems. Some seem to be the ancient equivalent of "call me maybe." They're personal, fleeting, and deeply human. Like finding a note scrawled on the back of a receipt. We also rely on tomb art, those colorful formal depictions of domestic life, couples at leisure, women playing music or offering flowers to their husbands. While these scenes were idealized, they still reflect the values of the time. Love, harmony, fertility, and shared labor were worth memorializing. No pharaoh wanted to spend eternity being depicted as grumpy and alone. And let's not forget the mythology. Egyptian creation stories and divine love affairs weren't whispered in dark corners. They were public, sacred, and embedded into national identity. Every temple bore witness to gods who embraced, argued, reunited, and sometimes got a little weird. The myths were not shy about divine passion. They leaned in with all the elegance and absurdity of a very old sitcom starring immortal characters. But here's what might be most surprising. There's no ancient Egyptian equivalent of a morality code telling people to be ashamed of their bodies, their urges, or their love lives. No sermons on sin, no rules against pleasure. There were rules, of course, rules about fidelity, inheritance, and consent, but not the kind that said desire was dirty. The body was just part of the cosmos, as worthy of respect as the Nile or the stars. Modern scholars didn't always appreciate this. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, when Victorian sensibilities shaped archaeology, references to sex or sensuality were often ignored, misinterpreted, or even censored. One early Egyptologist famously described the Turin erotic papyrus as a vulgar collection of unrelated scribbles, which is frankly the most British reaction possible. It's only in recent decades that historians have looked more closely at these materials and asked, wait, were these people just really open about all this? And the answer is yes, they were. That openness gives us a rare gift, a portrait of a society that embraced human intimacy as a normal, joyful, complex part of life. Not perfect, not always equal, but far more comfortable with the messy business of being human than many later civilizations would be. So what have we learned? We've seen that ancient Egyptians approached sex with a blend of practicality and poetry. They protected themselves with honey and crocodile dung. They wrote love poems with birds and beer metaphors. They married for alliance and affection, sometimes both. They believed romantic joy in this life and the next. And they carved all of it into limestone and papyrus with a confidence that says, yes, this matters. And in doing so, they left us a legacy not just of pyramids and pharaohs, but of glances, blushes, winks, and whispered promises. A reminder that history isn't just battles and borders, it's people, wanting, laughing, loving, trying their best with what they had in a world filled with gods, geese, and occasional golden prosthetics. So tonight, as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, maybe picture a sycamore tree swaying over the Nile, a couple walking hand in hand through the field of reeds, a midwife tying an amulet on a newborn, a scribe etching a poem that still somehow makes us smile. Because if the ancient Egyptians taught us anything, it's this love is worth remembering. And now with the Nile winding gently under the stars and the distant echoes of ancient flutes fading into the night, it's time to let the last of the stories settle. Imagine a soft breeze drifting through the reeds, carrying the scent of lotus and myrrh. The sky above, dark and endless, is scattered with stars, each one a memory, a name, a whispered promise, from a time when gods walked the earth and love poems were written with reed pens on pottery shards. In this world, nothing was too small to matter. A glance, a touch the offering of a fig, or a folded scrap of linen, each gesture was part of something larger, part of a dance between the divine and the human, between joy and duty, between now and forever. So breathe in slowly and let that breath carry you backward gently into the arms of time, to a place where love wasn't hidden in corners, but painted on walls, where desire didn't come with shame, where even the gods, in all their power, still needed companionship. Let your thoughts become light. Let them float like papyrus on the river. There's no need to remember every detail, only the feeling of connection, of curiosity, of comfort in knowing that thousands of years ago, someone else stared up at the same stars and dreamed, "You're safe now." The ancient world has tucked you in. The hippos are quiet, the tambourines have gone still, and the goddess of the sky watches over you, her arms outstretched, holding back the night. Sleep well, traveler. Tomorrow will wait. But for now, let history hum softly in your bones.